The whistle of the train pierced the spring air as it slowed into Stockton, California, sending plumes of black smoke into the clear blue sky. Nora Mitchell clutched her small valise with one hand and the crumpled photograph of her soon-to-be husband with the other, her heart hammering against her ribs like a wild Mustang. The year was 1875, and after 3 months of exchanging letters with Richard Finch, she had traveled all the way from Boston to marry a man she had never met face to face. Nora stepped onto the wooden platform, her legs wobbly after days of travel. She smoothed down her blue traveling dress, wishing she had something finer to wear for her first meeting with Richard. The photograph in her hand showed a clean-shaven man with kind eyes and a gentle smile. According to his letters, he would be wearing a brown jacket and a cream-colored hat. Her eyes scanned the crowd of people milling about the station. Several men in various states of dusty attire stood waiting, but none matched the description or the photograph. Anxiety began to bubble in her stomach. Had he forgotten? Had she arrived on the wrong day, Miss Mitchell? A deep voice called from behind her. Nora turned, relief flooding through her until she saw the man before her. Tall and broad-shouldered, with a weathered face that spoke of years under the harsh western sun, he looked nothing like the photograph she held. His dark hair was slightly too long, and a neatly trimmed beard framed a strong jaw. His eyes were a startling blue against his sun-darkened skin. "Why, yes," she stammered, glancing down at her photograph in confusion. "I'm Roy Isaacs," he said, his voice deep and measured. "I reckon you're looking for Richard Finch." Nora nodded, clutching her valise tighter. "Do you know where he is?" A flash of something pity perhaps crossed Roy's face. "I'm afraid I have some bad news, Miss Mitchell. Richard Finch passed away 3 weeks ago. Typhoid fever took him quick." The world seemed to tilt beneath Nora's feet. Dead. The man she had traveled across the country to marry was dead. But his last letter, she whispered, thinking of the cheerful note she'd received just before departing Boston. "He wrote those letters in advance," Roy explained. "Asked his housekeeper to mail them while he was down with the fever. He didn't want to worry you none." Tears welled in Nora's eyes. She had left everything behind: her position as a schoolteacher, her small apartment, what few friends she had, all to marry a man who no longer existed. "I worked with Richard on his ranch," Roy continued. "He asked me to meet you if—" He paused, clearing his throat. "If things went poorly, I can take you to the boarding house in town. The owner, Mrs. Hollister, is expecting you." Nora wiped away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. "And then what? I have nothing to go back to in Boston." Roy shifted his weight, his eyes meeting hers. "Truth is, Miss Mitchell, Stockton could use a schoolteacher, something fierce. Our last one left for San Francisco 6 months ago. I can't just stay here," she said, though even as the words left her mouth, she wondered what other options she had. Roy's eyes crinkled slightly at the corners as a small smile played on his lips. "Well, seems to me like right place. Right time for me, I mean for Stockton. Needing a teacher and having one arrive on the afternoon train. Might be Providence." Nora studied the tall cowboy before her. There was something steady in his gaze, a dependability that radiated from him despite the devastating news he delivered. She took a deep breath. "I suppose I could stay. At least until I figure out what to do next." Roy nodded, reaching for her valise. "Let me help you with that. My wagon's just out front." As they walked toward the front of the station, Nora felt the weight of her situation pressing down on her. She had come to Stockton to be a bride, and now found herself alone in a strange town with only a cowboy she'd just met for company. "Mr. Isaacs," she said as they reached his wagon, "thank you for meeting me. I imagine this wasn't how you planned to spend your afternoon." Roy helped her up onto the wooden seat, his strong hands gentle as they guided her. "Miss Mitchell, I made a promise to a good man, and truth be told, there are worse ways to spend an afternoon than escorting a lady around Stockton." His words, simple as they were, provided a small comfort. Nora watched as he climbed up beside her and took the reins, giving them a gentle snap. The wagon lurched forward, carrying her toward a future nothing like the one she'd imagined when she boarded the train in Boston. The town of Stockton unfolded before Nora as Roy guided the wagon down the main street. Unlike the brick and stone buildings of Boston, Stockton's structures were predominantly wooden, with false fronts and covered boardwalks that provided shade from the California sun. Men in dusty clothes and wide-brimmed hats moved purposefully along the streets, while women in practical dresses hurried about their business. "It's not what I expected," Nora admitted, taking in the bustling scene. "What did you expect?" Roy asked, skillfully guiding the horses around a loaded hay wagon. Nora thought for a moment. "I suppose I imagined something smaller, more rustic." Roy chuckled, the sound warm and genuine. "Stockton's growing fast. The railroad brought folks in, and the agricultural land keeps them here. It's a proper city now, though we've still got our fair share of cowboys and farmers." He pointed out various establishments as they passed the general store, the bank, the saloon which he mentioned with a slight clearing of his throat, and finally, the schoolhouse. "That's where you'd be teaching if you decide to stay," he said, nodding toward a white wooden building with a small bell tower. Nora studied the building with a professional eye. It was modest, but seemed well maintained. "How many children attend?" "About 30, ranging from 6 to 16, Roy replied. "Some only come when they can be spared from farm work, mind you." They continued on, turning down a quieter side street lined with neat houses. Roy pulled the wagon to a stop in front of a 2-story house with a wrap-around porch and flower boxes in the windows. "Mrs. Hollister's boarding house," he announced. "Best meals in Stockton, if you don't mind my saying so." As if on cue, the front door opened and a plump woman with silver-streaked dark hair emerged, wiping her hands on her apron. "You must be Miss Mitchell," she called, descending the porch steps. "I'm Edith Hollister. Come in, come in. You must be exhausted from your journey." Roy helped Nora down from the wagon, his hands firm but gentle on her waist. The brief contact sent an unexpected flutter through her chest, which she quickly attributed to her frazzled nerves. "Mrs. Hollister, this is Miss Mitchell," Roy said, tipping his hat to the older woman. "She's had quite a shock learning about Richard." Edith's face softened with sympathy. "Oh, my dear, such a terrible thing. Richard was a fine man." "Thank you," Nora murmured, unsure of what else to say. She had never met Richard in person, and her grief felt hollow compared to the apparent loss felt by those who had known him. "I'll bring your trunk up shortly," Roy said, gesturing to the large trunk strapped to the back of his wagon. "Oh, that's very kind, but no buts," Roy interrupted with a gentle smile. "It's no trouble. Get yourself settled and I'll be back with your belongings." As Roy drove away to turn the wagon around, Edith led Nora into the boarding house. The interior was clean and well-furnished, with a parlor to the right and a dining room to the left. The scent of baking bread and something savory wafted from the back of the house. "I've prepared the blue room for you," Edith said, leading Nora up a polished wooden staircase. "It's at the front of the house, so you'll have a nice view of the street." The room was modest but charming, with a brass bed covered in a blue and white quilt, a small writing desk by the window, a washstand with a porcelain basin, and a wardrobe for her clothes. "It's lovely," Nora said, genuinely appreciative of the clean, comfortable space. "Dinner's at 6, Edith informed her. "You'll have time to freshen up. The washroom is at the end of the hall if you'd like a proper wash. Left alone, Nora sank onto the edge of the bed, finally allowing the tears she'd been holding back to flow freely. She cried for the future she had imagined, for the man she had never met but had hoped to love, and for her own foolishness in leaving everything behind for a dream that had died before she even reached California. A soft knock at the door interrupted her tears. She quickly wiped her face and called, "Come in." Roy entered, carrying her trunk with apparent ease. He set it down at the foot of the bed, then straightened, his eyes taking in her tear-stained face. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said quietly. Nora gave a small, sad laugh. "Can you lose someone you never actually had?" Roy considered this, his blue eyes thoughtful. "I reckon you can lose the future you thought you were going to have. That's a real enough loss." His understanding, so simply stated, brought fresh tears to her eyes. She turned away embarrassed. "Miss Mitchell," Roy said, his voice gentle, "I know this isn't my place, but if you're willing to stay at least for a while, I'd be happy to show you around Stockton, help you get settled." Nora looked back at him, surprised by the offer. "Why would you do that?" "Because it's what Richard would have wanted," he said. Then, after a pause, he added with a slight smile, "And because I think Stockton might be just what you need right now, even if you don't know it yet." There was something in his steady gaze that steadied her in turn. Nora found herself nodding. "Thank you, Mr. Isaacs, I'd appreciate that." "Roy," he corrected. "Everyone just calls me Roy." "Then I'm Nora," she replied. Roy nodded, a small smile playing at his lips. "Nora," he repeated as if testing the name. "I'll come by tomorrow morning, say around 9. I can take you to meet the town council. They're the ones who'll hire you for the teaching position if you're interested." "I'd like that," Nora said, finding that she meant it. After Roy left, Nora unpacked her trunk, hanging her modest collection of dresses in the wardrobe. As she did so, she came across the packet of letters from Richard, tied with a blue ribbon. She sat at the small desk by the window and untied the bundle, reading through them once more. The letters painted a picture of a kind, thoughtful man who wanted a partner in life, not just a housekeeper or a mother for future children. He had written of his ranch outside of town, of the fruit trees he had planted, of his hopes for children someday. It was those letters that had convinced her to accept his proposal, despite never having met him. With a sigh, she tied the ribbon around the letters again and tucked them into the desk drawer. Richard Finch might be gone, but she was still here in Stockton, and for now at least, that was where she would remain. The morning sunlight streamed through the lace curtains, casting intricate patterns on the wooden floor of Nora's room. She had slept surprisingly well, exhaustion from her journey overriding her troubled thoughts. Now, dressed in her best navy blue dress with a white lace collar, she waited nervously for Roy's arrival. Dinner the previous evening had been a quiet affair with just Mrs. Hollister and one other boarder, an elderly gentleman who worked at the bank. Mrs. Hollister had kindly avoided asking too many questions about Richard or Nora's plans, instead filling the silence with tales of Stockton's early days and the characters who populated the growing town. At precisely 9 o'clock, a knock sounded at the boarding house door. Nora descended the stairs to find Roy in the foyer, hat in hand, dressed in clean clothes that, while still practical for ranch work, were clearly his best. "Good morning," he greeted, his eyes warming as they took in her appearance. "You look rested." "I am, thank you," Nora replied, finding herself unreasonably pleased by his notice. "Mrs. Hollister keeps a very comfortable house." "That she does," Roy agreed, offering his arm. "Shall we?" "The council meets at the town hall, just down the street." As they walked, Roy pointed out various businesses and introduced Nora to people they passed. Everyone seemed genuinely pleased to meet her, their welcome warm and sincere. "People here are very friendly," Nora observed, smiling at a woman who had just greeted her enthusiastically from across the street. "Word travels fast in Stockton," Roy explained. "Everyone knows about Richard, and they're all hoping you'll stay to teach. Our children have been making do with parents taking turns teaching basic reading and figures but a proper education." He trailed off, looking slightly embarrassed. "Education is important," Nora finished for him, "even perhaps especially on the frontier." Roy's smile revealed his relief at her understanding. "Exactly. Most folks here understand that. They want better for their children than they had themselves." The town hall was a two-story building with a small dome on top, more impressive than Nora had expected. Inside, 5 men sat at a long table in a meeting room, papers spread before them. They stood as Nora and Roy entered. "Gentlemen, this is Miss Nora Mitchell," Roy introduced. "Miss Mitchell, these are our town council members." The men introduced themselves one by one. Mayor Bennett, a portly man with an impressive mustache, Mr. Parker, who owned the general store, Dr. Wilson, the town physician, Mr. Abernathy, a banker, and Mr. Jenkins, a rancher with a weathered face and kind eyes. "Miss Mitchell, we were saddened to hear of your circumstances," Mayor Bennett began once they were all seated. "Richard Finch was well respected in this community." "Thank you," Nora replied, folding her hands in her lap to keep them from trembling. "I appreciate your kindness." "Roy tells us you were a school teacher in Boston," Mr. Parker said, getting straight to business. "We're in desperate need of someone to educate our children." Nora straightened her spine. This, at least, was familiar territory. "I taught for 5 years at a girls' school in Boston. Before that, I attended the normal school for teacher training. I'm qualified to teach all the standard subjects." The men exchanged approving glances. "And what would you require in terms of compensation?" Mr. Abernathy asked. Nora had given this some thought. "I would need room and board, plus a modest salary for personal expenses and supplies for the school. We can offer $60 per month, plus continued residence at Mrs. Hollister's boarding house," Mayor Bennett said after a brief consultation with the others. "The town will also provide basic supplies for the school, though we would welcome your input on what additional materials might be needed." $60 a month was more than she had earned in Boston, and without the expense of her own lodgings to worry about, Nora would be able to save a considerable amount. She nodded her acceptance. "When could you start?" Dr. Wilson asked. "I would need a few days to assess the schoolhouse and prepare lessons," Nora replied, her mind already racing with plans. "Perhaps Monday next." "Excellent," Mayor Bennett declared, slapping his palm lightly on the table. "Welcome to Stockton, Miss Mitchell. We're mighty glad to have you." After signing the necessary paperwork, Nora found herself walking back down the main street with Roy, a new sense of purpose lightening her steps. "You were impressive in there," Roy said, his voice warm with admiration. "They didn't stand a chance." Nora laughed, the sound surprising her. When was the last time she had truly laughed? "I didn't realize I was battling them." "Maybe not, but you certainly won," Roy replied with a grin. "Now, how about I show you the schoolhouse? You'll want to see what you're working with." The schoolhouse, upon closer inspection, was better equipped than Nora had dared hope. There were rows of desks, a large blackboard, a decent supply of chalk, and even a small bookshelf with various readers and arithmetic books. "It's not exactly the Boston Athenaeum, but it's a start," Roy said, watching as Nora examined the books. "You know the Athenaeum?" Nora asked, surprised. Roy's cheeks reddened slightly. "I spent some time back east in my younger days. Worked my way through a few books while I was there." Nora studied him with new interest. There was clearly more to Roy Isaacs than met the eye. The children will need slates, she mused, turning back to the task at hand. And more books, certainly. Perhaps we could organize some sort of lending library for the town as well. Roy's smile widened. Already planning to improve all of Stockton, are you? Nora blushed, realizing she had been thinking aloud. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to presume. No, Roy interrupted, his eyes warm. I think it's a fine idea. This town could use someone with vision. They spent the next hour examining the schoolhouse, with Nora making notes about necessary improvements and supplies. As they worked, Roy told her about some of the children she would be teaching: the Henderson twins, who were bright but mischievous; little Sarah Parker, who already read better than her older brothers; and Tom Jenkins, who struggled with his letters but could calculate the value of a herd of cattle faster than most adults. By the time they locked up the schoolhouse, Nora felt a growing excitement about her new position. It wouldn't be the life she had imagined when she boarded the train in Boston, but it might be a good life all the same. Are you hungry? Roy asked as they stepped back onto the main street. Parker's wife runs a small cafe next to the general store, makes a fine apple pie. Nora realized she was, in fact, quite hungry. That sounds lovely. The cafe was small but clean, with checkered tablecloths and vases of wildflowers on each table. Mrs. Parker, a cheerful woman with laugh lines around her eyes, greeted them warmly. You must be our new teacher, she said, showing them to a table by the window. My Sarah hasn't stopped talking about starting school again since she heard you might be staying. I look forward to teaching her, Nora replied with a genuine smile. Over a lunch of hearty beef stew, fresh bread, and the promised apple pie, Roy told Nora more about Stockton and its residents. She learned that he had come west after the war between the states, like many men seeking a fresh start. He had worked various jobs before settling in Stockton 5 years ago and taking a position as foreman on Richard Finch's ranch. And what will happen to the ranch now? Nora asked, realizing she knew nothing of Richard's arrangements after his death. Roy set down his fork, his expression sobering. Richard had a nephew back east who inherits everything. Fellow by the name of Edward Finch. Never met him myself, but Richard spoke well of him. We're expecting him to arrive in the next month or so to either take over the ranch or sell it. Nora nodded, feeling a strange pang at the thought of Richard's property, the home that might have been hers, passing to a stranger. And will you stay on, if this Edward decides to run the ranch? She asked. Roy shrugged, his broad shoulders rising and falling beneath his blue shirt. That'll be up to him, I suppose. I know the operation well enough, but some men prefer to bring in their own people. There was something in his tone that suggested the prospect of leaving the ranch bothered him more than he was letting on. You care about the place, Nora observed quietly. Roy's blue eyes met hers, a flash of surprise in them at her perception. I do, he admitted. Richard built something good there. Treated his men fair, took care of the land. I'd hate to see that change. His dedication to his late employer's legacy touched Nora. It spoke of a loyalty and sense of responsibility that seemed increasingly rare in the world. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a young woman who approached their table with a determined stride. Roy Isaacs, I've been looking all over town for you, she declared, her hands on her hips. Roy stood quickly, his expression a mixture of guilt and resignation. Miss Mitchell, this is Nancy Wilson, the doctor's daughter. Nancy, this is Miss Mitchell, our new schoolteacher. Nancy Wilson was a pretty young woman with auburn hair and a sprinkling of freckles across her nose. She gave Nora a quick, assessing glance before turning back to Roy. Papa needs you to come look at his horse. Says he's favoring his right foreleg and won't put weight on it. I'll be there directly, Roy promised, then turned to Nora with an apologetic smile. "I'm afraid duty calls, Doctor. Wilson's horse is his pride and joy, and I have something of a way with horses." "Of course," Nora said, trying to ignore the small stab of disappointment at their afternoon being cut short. "Thank you for showing me around today." "It was my pleasure," Roy replied, his gaze lingering on hers for a moment before he turned back to Nancy. "Lead the way, Miss Wilson." As the pair left, Nora couldn't help but wonder if there was something between Roy and the doctor's daughter. The thought brought an unexpected twinge of jealousy, which she quickly dismissed as ridiculous. She barely knew Roy Isaacs, and she was still technically in mourning for Richard, even if their relationship had been conducted entirely through letters. With a sigh, Nora finished her pie and paid for her meal, resolving to spend the rest of the afternoon at the schoolhouse, planning lessons and making lists of needed supplies. Work had always been her solace, and now was no different. If her thoughts occasionally strayed to a pair of kind blue eyes in a sun-weathered face, well, that was nobody's business but her own. The days leading up to Nora's first day of teaching passed in a blur of preparation. Roy appeared each morning to accompany her to the schoolhouse, where they worked together to ready the building for students. He mended broken desks, hung a new map of the United States that Mayor Bennett had procured, and even built a small set of shelves for Nora's growing collection of books, donated by various townspeople eager to support their new teacher. Nora found herself looking forward to these mornings, to Roy's steady presence and quiet humor. He wasn't a man of many words, but when he did speak, his observations were thoughtful and often surprisingly insightful. And if she noticed the way his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal strong forearms as he worked, or how his smile transformed his entire face, she told herself it was merely appreciation for his help. On the Sunday before school was to begin, Roy surprised her by appearing at the boarding house with a small bouquet of wildflowers. "For luck tomorrow," he said, handing them to her with a slight duck of his head, as if embarrassed by the gesture. "They're beautiful," Nora said, genuinely touched. "Thank you, Roy. I thought you might like to see a bit of the countryside today," he suggested, his hat in his hands. "You've been working so hard getting ready for the school, but there's more to Stockton than just the town itself." Nora hesitated only briefly before agreeing. The day was beautiful, warm but not yet hot, with a clear blue sky that seemed to stretch forever. Roy had brought his wagon, and they rode east out of town, past fields being prepared for spring planting. He pointed out various ranches and farms as they passed, naming their owners and occasionally sharing an anecdote about them. "And that's the Finch Ranch," he said at last, gesturing toward a property that spread out before them, a neat white farmhouse visible in the distance, surrounded by orchards just beginning to bloom. Nora gazed at what might have been her home, feeling a complex mixture of emotions. There was sadness, certainly, for the life that would never be, but also a strange sense of peace. The ranch was beautiful, but it didn't feel like it should have been hers. "Would you like to see it closer?" Roy asked quietly. Nora shook her head. "No, I don't think so, not today." Roy nodded, seeming to understand. He turned the wagon down a side road that led toward a small stream lined with willows. There, he brought the horses to a halt in a shady spot. "I thought we might have a bite to eat," he said, reaching behind the seat to produce a basket. "Mrs. Hollister packed us a picnic when I told her where we were going." "That was very thoughtful of her," Nora said, smiling at the idea of the boarding house keeper playing matchmaker. For that was surely what this was, though neither of them had acknowledged it aloud. They spread a blanket beneath one of the willows, and Roy unpacked the basket, revealing fried chicken, biscuits, apple slices, and a jar of lemonade. As they ate, the conversation flowed easily between them, moving from topics like books they had read to their childhood's Nora's in a small town outside of Boston, Roy's on a farm in Pennsylvania. "How did you end up out west?" Nora asked, curious about the path that had led him to Stockton. Roy was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the stream. "I fought in the war," he said finally. "Came back different like a lot of men did. Couldn't settle back into farm life with my family, needed something else." Nora nodded, understanding the unspoken parts of his story. Many men had returned from the war between the states changed, haunted by what they had seen and done. Some found peace in the wide open spaces of the West, away from the memories that plagued them in the East. "And did you find it?" she asked softly. "What you were looking for?" Roy's eyes met hers, their blue depths thoughtful. "I'm starting to think I might have," he said, his voice low. The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with a tension that was both frightening and exhilarating. Nora looked away first, her cheeks warming. "Tell me about the school," she said, changing the subject to safer ground. "What was the previous teacher like?" Roy accepted the shift in conversation with good grace, describing the stern older woman who had taught in Stockton before leaving for San Francisco. By the time they had finished their meal and packed up the remains, the moment of intensity had passed, but something had changed between them, a recognition of feelings that could no longer be entirely ignored. As they drove back toward town in the late afternoon light, Nora found herself wondering what Richard would think of her growing attachment to his former foreman. Would he be upset? Or would he, as Roy had suggested that first day, want her to find happiness in Stockton, even if it wasn't the happiness they had planned together? "Penny for your thoughts," Roy said, breaking into her reverie. Nora smiled, shaking her head. "I'm not sure they're worth even that much. Just wondering about tomorrow, I suppose. Whether the children will like me, whether I'll be a good teacher for them." "They'll love you," Roy said with such certainty that Nora felt a flush of pleasure. "And you'll be exactly what they need." His confidence in her bolstered her own, and by the time he dropped her off at the boarding house, Nora felt ready to face her first day of teaching in Stockton with a calm assurance that had been missing before. Standing on the porch, she turned to thank him for the day. "I enjoyed it very much," she said sincerely. Roy smiled, that transformative expression that lit up his entire face. "As did I, Miss Mitchell." "Nora," she corrected him gently. "Nora," he repeated, his voice warming the syllables of her name in a way that sent a small shiver down her spine. "Good luck tomorrow, though you won't need it." As she watched him drive away, Nora realized with a start that she had spent the entire day without once thinking of herself as a woman in mourning. Instead, she had felt like a woman on the cusp of something new and potentially wonderful. The realization should have brought guilt, but instead it filled her with a quiet hope. 27 pairs of eyes stared at Nora as she stood before the assembled children in the schoolhouse the next morning. They ranged in age from 6 to 16, as Roy had said, and represented a diverse cross-section of Stockton's families, farmers' children, merchants' children, and even a few from the wealthier ranching families. "Good morning," Nora began, pleased that her voice sounded steady despite the fluttering in her stomach. "I am Miss Mitchell, and I will be your teacher." A small girl in the front row, Sarah Parker, Nora guessed from Roy's description, raised her hand immediately. "Yes," Nora acknowledged her. "Are you the lady who was supposed to marry Mr. Finch?" Sarah asked boldly, causing a ripple of whispers among the other children. Nora took a deep breath, deciding honesty was the best approach. "Yes, I came to Stockton to marry Mr. Finch. Unfortunately, he passed away before I arrived. But I'm very pleased to be here as your teacher instead." This straightforward answer seemed to satisfy the children, and they settled down as Nora began to outline her expectations for the classroom and her plans for their education. The day passed quickly as Nora assessed the children's varying levels of knowledge and skill. As she had expected, there were significant gaps in their education due to the haphazard nature of their previous schooling. Some of the older boys, she noted, seemed resistant to the idea of spending time in school when they could be working alongside their fathers. That would be a challenge to overcome. By the time the final bell rang at 3 o'clock, Nora was exhausted but exhilarated. Teaching had always been her passion, and these children, with their eager minds and direct questions, promised to be as rewarding a group of pupils as she had ever taught. As the children filed out, Sarah Parker lingered behind, clutching a small, slightly wilted bunch of daisies. "These are for you, Miss Mitchell," she said, thrusting the flowers toward Nora. "Mama says flowers make a room more cheerful." "Thank you, Sarah," Nora said, touched by the gesture. "They're lovely." The little girl beamed, then skipped out of the schoolhouse, calling goodbye over her shoulder. Nora was placing the daisies in a jar of water on her desk when she heard a knock at the open door. Looking up, she saw Roy leaning against the doorframe, his hat in his hands. "How was your first day?" he asked, his expression warm with genuine interest. "Wonderful," Nora replied with a smile. "Exhausting, but wonderful. The children are bright and curious, if a bit behind where they should be. They'll catch up quickly with you teaching them," Roy said, stepping into the schoolhouse. "I thought you might like some company on your walk back to town." Nora felt a flutter of pleasure at his thoughtfulness. "That would be lovely, thank you." As they walked back toward Stockton's Main Street, Nora told Roy about her day, the questions the children had asked, the subjects they seemed most interested in, the challenges she foresaw in reaching some of the more reluctant learners. "You know, these older boys, the ones who think they should be out working instead of learning algebra, they might respond better to practical applications," Roy suggested. "Show them how figuring acreage for planting or calculating the value of a herd uses the same skills." Nora looked at him with newfound respect. "That's an excellent idea. I hadn't considered that approach." Roy shrugged, a touch of color rising in his cheeks at her praise. "Just something I've observed. Boys that age want to feel like men. If you can show them how education makes them better at men's work, they'll be more likely to apply themselves." "You're very perceptive, Mr. Isaacs," Nora said, using his surname teasingly. Roy's lips quirked in a half-smile. "Only about some things, Miss Mitchell." Their eyes met, and that now familiar tension stretched between them, a tentative bridge of attraction and growing affection. The moment was broken by the arrival of Nancy Wilson, who rounded the corner just ahead of them, her face lighting up when she saw Roy. "Roy, I was just coming to find you," she called, hurrying toward them. "Papa says Thunder is much improved, thanks to your treatment." "Glad to hear it," Roy replied, his tone friendly but noticeably cooler than when he spoke to Nora. "Miss Wilson, I believe you've met our new teacher." "Yes, of course," Nancy said, giving Nora a quick nod before turning back to Roy. "I was wondering if you might escort me to the social on Saturday. Mama says it would be proper for me to have an escort, and since you've done so in the past." Nora felt a sharp pang of jealousy at the young woman's words. Of course, Roy had escorted Nancy before. She was young, pretty, and the daughter of a respected town physician. Why wouldn't he court her? "I'm afraid I've already asked Miss Mitchell to accompany me to the social," Roy said smoothly, surprising both women. Nancy's face fell momentarily before she recovered her composure. "Oh, well, that's lovely. I'm sure you'll both enjoy yourselves." "If you'll excuse me, I should be getting back to help Mama with dinner." As Nancy hurried away, Nora turned to Roy with raised eyebrows. "You've asked me to the social, have you?" Roy had the grace to look slightly abashed. "I was planning to this very afternoon. Nancy just forced my hand a bit." His expression grew more serious. "Unless you'd rather not attend with me, I would understand if you felt it was too soon after." "No," Nora interrupted, surprising herself with her certainty. "I would be honored to attend the social with you, Roy." Relief and pleasure washed over his features. "Then it's settled. I'll call for you at 7 on Saturday evening." As they continued their walk to the boarding house, Nora found herself looking forward to Saturday with an eagerness that both thrilled and frightened her. She had come to Stockton to marry one man and now found herself developing feelings for another, all within the span of a week. Was she being disloyal to Richard's memory? Or was this, as Roy had suggested that first day, a case of right place, right time for both of them? The Stockton Spring Social was held in the town hall, which had been transformed for the occasion with bunting, flowers, and tables laden with food prepared by the women of the community. A small band of local musicians played lively tunes in one corner, while couples danced in the cleared center of the room. Nora wore her best dress for the occasion, a green silk that she had originally packed for her wedding to Richard. She had hesitated before choosing it, worried it might seem inappropriate, but Mrs. Hollister had assured her that Richard would want her to wear her prettiest gown and enjoy herself. When Roy arrived to escort her, his appreciative gaze as it traveled over her confirmed she had made the right choice. He himself cut a striking figure in a black suit that, while not new, fit his broad shoulders perfectly. "You look beautiful," he said simply as he offered her his arm. "Thank you," Nora replied, feeling a blush warm her cheeks. "You're quite handsome yourself." The social was in full swing when they arrived, and Nora was immediately struck by the warm, familial atmosphere. Children darted between the adults, older couples sat chatting along the walls, and young men and women eyed each other shyly across the room. It was a community gathering in the truest sense, bringing together people of all ages and stations. Mayor Bennett approached them almost immediately, his wife, a small, bird-like woman, on his arm. "Miss Mitchell, so glad you could join us," he boomed. "Clara, this is our new school teacher." Mrs. Bennett clasped Nora's hands in hers. "The children have been talking of nothing else but their new teacher all week. You've made quite an impression." "They're wonderful children," Nora replied sincerely. "I'm enjoying teaching them very much." "And Roy," Mayor Bennett continued, clapping him on the shoulder, "good to see you out and about. You spend too much time at that ranch." "Someone has to keep things running until Edward Finch arrives," Roy replied with a good-natured shrug. "Speaking of which, Mrs. Bennett said, lowering her voice conspiratorially, "I hear he's due to arrive next week. Mr. Parker got a telegram just yesterday." Nora felt Roy tense slightly beside her. The arrival of Richard's nephew would determine Roy's future at the ranch he had helped build and manage. "That's good news," Roy said neutrally. "The sooner he arrives, the sooner decisions can be made about the property." Mrs. Bennett, perhaps sensing the undercurrent of tension, changed the subject. "Miss Mitchell, you must try some of Edith Hollister's apple cake. It's simply divine." As the evening progressed, Nora was introduced to what seemed like every resident of Stockton. She met parents of her students, shopkeepers, farmers, and ranchers. Everyone was welcoming and seemed genuinely pleased that she had decided to stay and teach. Eventually, Roy led her to the dance floor as the band struck up a waltz. "I should warn you," he said as he placed his hand at her waist, "I'm not the most graceful dancer." Nora smiled up at him. "Just follow the music, I'll follow you." Despite his warning, Roy proved to be a competent dancer, guiding Nora smoothly around the floor. The feeling of his hand at her waist, warm and strong, sent a thrill through her that had nothing to do with the dance. As they moved together, the rest of the room seemed to fade away. Nora was acutely aware of every point where their bodies connected, his hand holding hers, his other hand at her waist, the occasional brush of their legs as they turned. His eyes never left hers, and she found herself unable to look away from the intensity of his gaze. "People are watching us," Roy murmured, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Let them," Nora replied boldly, surprising herself with her lack of concern for propriety. Roy's smile deepened, the corners of his eyes crinkling in a way that made her heart skip. "You're full of surprises, Nora Mitchell." "So are you, Roy Isaacs," she countered, feeling a newfound confidence in his arms. They danced 2 more dances before taking a break for refreshments. As they stood near the punch bowl, Nora sipping the sweet drink, she noticed Nancy Wilson watching them from across the room, her expression wistful. "Nancy seems disappointed that you're here with me instead of her," Nora observed quietly. Roy followed her gaze, then sighed. "Nancy is a nice girl, but she has certain expectations that I can't fulfill. Her father wants her to marry a professional man, a doctor or lawyer, not a ranch foreman with nothing to his name but a horse and saddle." "Is that all you have?" Nora asked, curious about his circumstances. Roy's expression grew thoughtful. "I've saved some over the years, enough to buy a small spread of my own someday if the right opportunity comes along." He looked down at her, his gaze direct. "I believe in building something lasting, Nora. Something that can be passed down to children and grandchildren." The mention of children brought a flush to Nora's cheeks. There was no mistaking the direction of his thoughts, the implication that she might someday be the mother of those children. "That's a worthy goal," she said softly. The moment was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Wilson, who approached with a friendly smile. "Miss Mitchell, I wonder if I might steal Roy away for a moment. I have a question about one of the Finch ranch hands who came to see me today with an injury." "Of course," Nora replied, watching as Roy followed the doctor to a quieter corner of the room. Left alone, Nora took the opportunity to observe the social from the sidelines. She watched as children played a game of tag around the edges of the dance floor, as young couples gazed adoringly at each other, as older married pairs sat contentedly side by side, comfortable in their long companionship. It struck her that this was what she had been seeking when she agreed to marry Richard Finch, not just a husband, but a community, a sense of belonging. And somehow, despite the tragedy that had greeted her arrival in Stockton, she had found exactly that. Roy returned a few minutes later, his expression troubled. "Is everything all right?" Nora asked, concerned by the change in his demeanor. "One of our hands got his arm caught in some machinery," Roy explained. "Dr. Wilson says he'll recover, but he'll be out of commission for at least a month. It's just one more thing to manage before Edward Finch arrives." Nora laid her hand gently on his arm. "You take your responsibilities very seriously." Roy covered her hand with his own, his rough palm warm against her skin. "I gave Richard my word that I'd look after things." "I don't give my word lightly." The simple statement revealed so much about the man before her: his integrity, his sense of duty, his loyalty. Qualities that were increasingly rare in a world where men often sought the easiest path rather than the right one. "Would you like to take a turn outside?" Roy suggested, nodding toward the door. "It's getting rather warm in here." Nora nodded, and they made their way through the crowd to the entrance of the town hall. Outside, the spring night was cool and clear, stars scattered like diamonds across the black velvet of the sky. They walked a short distance from the building, the music and laughter fading behind them. Nora tilted her head back to gaze at the stars, marveling at their brilliance. "The stars never looked like this in Boston," she murmured. "There were too many buildings, too much smoke from the factories." "It's one of the things I love about the West," Roy replied, his voice soft in the quiet night. "The way you can see clear to forever." He was standing close beside her, his shoulder nearly touching hers. Nora could feel the warmth radiating from him, a contrast to the cool night air. "Nora," Roy said, turning to face her, his expression serious in the moonlight. "I know it's too soon. I know you came here to marry another man and I have no right to feel the way I do, but I can't help it." Nora's heart began to race, pounding so hard she was sure he must hear it in the stillness between them. "And how do you feel?" she whispered. Needing to hear him say it, Roy reached out, taking her hand in his. "Like I've been waiting for you without knowing it. Like everything that came before the war, the wandering, even coming to work for Richard was all leading me to be standing here with you now." His words resonated deep within her, echoing her own confused but increasingly certain feelings. "It doesn't make sense," she said softly. "We've known each other barely a week." "Some things don't need time to be true," Roy replied, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand. "Some things just are." He was right, Nora realized with sudden clarity. What she felt for Roy wasn't the result of loneliness or displacement or the shock of losing Richard. It was something real and true, a connection that had formed instantly and grown stronger with each passing day. "I feel it too," she admitted, her voice barely audible even to her own ears. Roy's intake of breath was sharp, as if her words had physically affected him. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he bent his head toward hers. Nora closed her eyes as his lips met hers, soft and tentative at first, then with growing confidence as she responded to his kiss. His hand came up to cradle her cheek, his touch gentle despite the calluses on his palm. Nora leaned into him, her own hand finding its way to his shoulder, feeling the solid strength beneath the fabric of his suit. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Roy rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that since the moment I saw you at the train station," he confessed. Nora smiled, a small laugh escaping her. "Even when I was looking for another man." "Even then," Roy admitted with a rueful smile, "though I felt mighty guilty about it at the time." The sound of the town hall door opening caused them to step apart quickly, though Roy kept hold of her hand. A couple emerged, too engrossed in their own conversation to notice Nora and Roy standing in the shadows. "We should go back inside," Nora said reluctantly. "People will talk if we're absent too long." Roy nodded, though his expression suggested he'd rather continue their private moment. "You're right, but Nora—" He hesitated, then continued with determination. "I'd like to court you properly if you'll allow it. I know it's soon after Richard, but—" "Yes," Nora interrupted, her decision made. "I would like that very much, Roy." His smile in response was radiant, lighting his entire face. Offering his arm once more, he led her back toward the warm light and music of the town hall, both of them stepping into a future neither had anticipated but both now eagerly embraced. The arrival of Edward Finch the following Wednesday caused a stir in Stockton. The Easterner stepped off the afternoon train wearing a suit that marked him immediately as a city dweller. His blonde hair neatly combed beneath a bowler hat that contrasted sharply with the wide-brimmed hats favored by the local men. Roy had gone to meet him as the foreman of his uncle's ranch, while Nora taught her classes. All day, she found her thoughts drifting to Roy and the meeting that would determine his future at the ranch he had helped build. By the time the school day ended, she was nearly as anxious as if her own future hung in the balance, which, in a way, it did. Her growing feelings for Roy meant that his concerns were becoming her concerns as well. She was straightening the schoolroom after the children had left when the door opened, admitting Roy and a slender man she presumed was Edward Finch. Roy's expression was carefully neutral, giving her no hint of how the meeting had gone. "Nora," Roy said, stepping into the schoolhouse, "I'd like you to meet Edward Finch, Richard's nephew. Edward, this is Miss Nora Mitchell, our school teacher." Edward Finch stepped forward, extending his hand with a pleasant smile. "Miss Mitchell, a pleasure to meet you. I understand you were corresponding with my uncle before his unfortunate passing." "Yes, I was," Nora replied, taking his hand briefly. "I'm very sorry for your loss. Your uncle seemed like a wonderful man from his letters." "He was indeed," Edward agreed, genuine sadness crossing his features. "I only wish I had visited him out here while I had the chance. He wrote often of how much he loved this land." There was an awkward silence as all three of them considered the strange situation: Nora, who had come to marry Richard; Roy, who had worked closely with him; and Edward, his blood relative who had inherited everything but had never seen the ranch. "Roy has kindly offered to show me the ranch this afternoon," Edward continued, breaking the silence. "I was hoping you might join us for dinner there this evening. The housekeeper, Mrs. Benson, has prepared a meal and I would appreciate the company. It's a rather large house to dine in alone." Nora glanced at Roy, who gave a small nod, his eyes conveying that he wanted her there. "I would be happy to join you," she said, turning back to Edward. "Excellent," Edward replied with a smile. "We'll come back to town to collect you around 6 if that suits." After they left, Nora hurried back to the boarding house to change out of her teaching dress into something more suitable for dinner. Mrs. Hollister, ever observant, noticed her haste. "Going somewhere special this evening?" she asked as Nora descended the stairs in a blue dress she had yet to wear in Stockton. "Dinner at the Finch Ranch," Nora explained. "Edward Finch arrived today and invited me to join him and Roy." Mrs. Hollister's eyebrows rose slightly. "Did he now? Interesting." She studied Nora for a moment, then added, "You and Roy Isaacs have grown quite close this past week." It wasn't a question, but Nora felt compelled to respond anyway. "Yes, we have. He's been very kind, helping me adjust to Stockton." "He's a good man," Mrs. Hollister said with approval. "One of the best. Not many knew it, but he's the one who looked after Richard during his illness, sat with him night and day toward the end." This was news to Nora, and it deepened her already growing respect and admiration for Roy. "He never mentioned that." "He wouldn't," Mrs. Hollister replied with a small smile. "Not the type to talk about his own good deeds, but I thought you should know, especially given the way he looks at you." Before Nora could respond to this observation, there was a knock at the door, signaling the arrival of Roy and Edward. Mrs. Hollister gave her a knowing look before going to answer it. The Finch Ranch was every bit as impressive as Nora had imagined from the glimpse Roy had shown her the previous weekend. The main house was a substantial 2-story structure with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. Behind it were various outbuildings, a barn, stables, bunkhouses for the ranch hands, and storage sheds. As they approached, Nora could see the orchards Richard had mentioned in his letters stretching out to one side of the property, the trees covered in delicate spring blossoms. On the other side, cattle grazed in lush pastures that extended as far as the eye could see. "It's beautiful," she murmured as Roy helped her down from the wagon. "Uncle Richard built something special here," Edward agreed, his expression thoughtful as he surveyed the property. "I can see why he loved it so much." Mrs. Benson, the housekeeper, greeted them at the door, a matronly woman with graying hair and a no-nonsense manner that reminded Nora of some of the teachers she had worked with in Boston. "Dinner will be ready in half an hour, Mr. Finch," she informed Edward. "I've set the table in the dining room and laid out some of the late Mr. Finch's best wine." "Thank you, Mrs. Benson," Edward replied with a warm smile that seemed to soften the housekeeper's stern demeanor slightly. As they waited for dinner, Edward gave Nora a tour of the house while Roy excused himself to check on something in the barn. The interior of the Finch home was comfortable rather than ostentatious, with solid furniture, good books, and a few carefully chosen pieces of art. It spoke of a man of taste and means who valued substance over show. "This would have been your home," Edward observed quietly as they stood in the study, a room lined with bookshelves and dominated by a large oak desk. Nora nodded, running her hand along the spines of the books. "Yes, it would have, but perhaps things worked out as they were meant to." Edward gave her a shrewd look. "You're referring to Roy Isaacs, I presume? I noticed the way he looks at you." Nora felt heat rise to her cheeks. Was it so obvious to everyone? "Roy has been very kind to me since my arrival." "More than kind, I'd wager," Edward said with a small smile that held no judgment. "My uncle would have approved, I think. He wrote often of Roy's integrity and capability, said he was the best man he'd ever hired." This endorsement from Richard himself, through his nephew, eased a guilt Nora hadn't fully acknowledged, the worry that she was somehow being disloyal to Richard's memory by developing feelings for Roy. "What are your plans for the ranch?" she asked, changing the subject. Edward sighed, moving to the window that overlooked the property. "That's the question, isn't it? I'm a banker by trade, Miss Mitchell. I know nothing of ranching or orchards, but this place was my uncle's life's work. I'd hate to see it broken up or mismanaged." Before Nora could respond, Mrs. Benson appeared to announce that dinner was served, and Roy rejoined them, his hands freshly washed but his hair slightly wind-blown, as if he'd been out riding. Dinner was a pleasant affair, with Mrs. Benson serving a roast beef with vegetables from the ranch's own garden, followed by an apple tart that melted in the mouth. The conversation flowed easily, with Edward asking questions about Stockton and its residents, and Roy providing thoughtful, detailed answers about the ranch's operations and prospects. As they enjoyed coffee after the meal, Edward leaned back in his chair, his expression turning serious. "Roy, I've been considering the future of the ranch," he began, causing both Roy and Nora to tense slightly. "As I told Miss Mitchell earlier, I'm a banker, not a rancher. I have commitments in Boston that I can't abandon. But I also don't want to sell my uncle's legacy to strangers who might not appreciate what he built here." Roy nodded, his face carefully neutral. "I understand. There would be plenty of buyers if you did decide to sell. The land alone is valuable, not to mention the established orchards and cattle operation." Edward smiled, shaking his head. "That's not what I'm leading to. Actually, I was hoping to propose a partnership of sorts." Roy's eyebrows rose in surprise. "A partnership?" "Yes," Edward confirmed. "You would continue to manage the ranch, make the day-to-day decisions, oversee the hands. I would provide capital for expansion when needed and handle the financial aspects from Boston. We would split the profits, with you receiving a larger share to reflect your greater involvement in the operation." Roy sat back, clearly stunned by the offer. "That's extremely generous, Edward." "It's practical," Edward corrected him. "My uncle trusted you with his ranch while he was alive. I see no reason why that should change now that he's gone. And this way, the ranch stays intact, continues to provide employment for the hands, and hopefully prospers." Nora watched the play of emotions across Roy's face: surprise, gratitude, and finally, determination. "I accept," Roy said, extending his hand across the table. though I think we should have a proper contract drawn up by a lawyer for both our sakes." Edward shook his hand firmly. "Of course. I'll arrange for my lawyer in Sacramento to prepare the necessary documents." The remainder of the evening passed in a glow of relief and celebration. As Roy drove Nora back to town later that night, the stars overhead seemed especially brilliant, as if reflecting the new brightness of their future. "I can hardly believe it," Roy said, his voice still holding a note of wonder. "I expected him to sell, or at best, keep me on as foreman for a while before bringing in his own people." "Edward seems like a sensible man who knows his own limitations," Nora observed. "And he clearly respected his uncle's judgment in hiring you." Roy glanced at her, his expression softening in the moonlight. "This changes things, Nora. I'm no longer just a hired hand. I'm part owner of one of the largest ranches in the county." Nora understood the significance of what he wasn't saying explicitly. His new position made him a man of substance in the community, someone who could provide a secure future for a wife and children. "I'm very happy for you, Roy," she said softly. "You deserve this recognition of your hard work and loyalty." They rode in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the creak of the wagon and the steady clip-clop of the horses' hooves on the road. "Nora," Roy said finally, his voice serious, "I know we've only known each other a short time, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life. I care for you deeply, more than I thought possible." Her heart quickening, Nora turned to look at him. "I care for you too, Roy." "I'm not asking for promises yet," he continued, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Just the chance to court you properly, to see where these feelings might lead us." "I would like that very much," Nora replied, happiness bubbling up inside her like a spring. Roy's smile in response was like the sunrise, gradual but transformative, lighting up his entire face. He reached across the seat to take her hand in his, and they rode the rest of the way back to town hand in hand, the future stretching before them like the star-filled sky above. The weeks that followed took on a rhythm that felt both new and comfortingly familiar to Nora. Her days were filled with teaching, while her evenings and weekends often included Roy's company. He took her on picnics by the stream, escorted her to church on Sundays, and sometimes simply sat with her on the porch of Mrs. Hollister's boarding house, talking as the sun set over Stockton. Their courtship progressed with a measured pace that both honored the relative newness of their relationship and acknowledged the depth of feeling that had developed so quickly between them. Roy was always respectful, mindful of Nora's reputation as the town's schoolteacher, but there was no mistaking the warmth in his eyes when he looked at her, or the lingering touch of his hand when he helped her into his wagon. Edward Finch remained in Stockton for 2 weeks, enough time to finalize the partnership agreement with Roy and to learn the basics of the ranch operation. He also made a point of visiting Nora's school, donating books from his uncle's library, and establishing a small scholarship fund for any Stockton student who wished to pursue higher education. "My uncle believed in the power of education," Edward explained when Nora thanked him for his generosity. "He would be pleased to know that the children of Stockton will have opportunities he never had." Before returning to Boston, Edward invited Nora and Roy to dinner once more at the ranch house, which he had now officially deeded partly to Roy as per their agreement. "I'll be returning in the fall to check on things," he told them over dessert. "But in the meantime, Roy, I trust you'll keep me informed by letter of any major developments." "Of course," Roy agreed, "and I appreciate the trust you're placing in me, Edward." Edward smiled, his gaze moving between Roy and Nora. "It's not misplaced, I'm sure, and I expect the next time I visit there might be some changes around here." His meaningful look made both of them blush slightly. After Edward's departure, Roy divided his time between the ranch and town, where Nora was completing her first term as Stockton's teacher. The school year was to end in mid-June, giving the children time to help with summer planting and harvesting before resuming their education in the fall. As the final day of school approached, Nora found herself reflecting on the remarkable turn her life had taken since arriving in Stockton. She had come as a mail-order bride, expecting to marry a man she knew only through letters. Instead, she had found a community that welcomed her, a profession that fulfilled her, and a man who stirred feelings in her that she had never experienced before. On the last day of school, the children surprised her with gifts, handmade cards, a bouquet of wildflowers, a basket of Mrs. Parker's famous apple tarts, and even a small wooden box crafted by Tom Jenkins, who had indeed improved his reading once Nora showed him how it connected to the ranching skills he valued. "For keeping your special things, Miss Mitchell," Tom explained as she admired the box's smooth finish and carefully fitted lid. "It's beautiful, Tom," she said, genuinely impressed by his craftsmanship. "Thank you." After the children had gone, Nora remained in the schoolhouse, organizing materials for the fall term and reflecting on her first months in Stockton. She was so absorbed in her thoughts that she didn't hear the door open, only becoming aware of Roy's presence when he spoke. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, using the phrase that had become something of a private joke between them. Nora looked up with a smile. "Just thinking about how different my life is from what I expected when I boarded that train in Boston." Roy crossed the room to stand beside her desk, his presence as always bringing a sense of warmth and security. "Better or worse? Different," she said thoughtfully, "but I think better in ways I couldn't have imagined." Roy nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I've been doing some thinking too, Nora. About us, about the future." Something in his tone made her heart skip a beat. She stood, putting herself at a more equal level with him, though he still towered over her by several inches. "Have you?" she asked softly. "I have," he confirmed, reaching into his pocket. "And I've come to a decision, though it depends entirely on yours." With that, he withdrew a small box and opened it to reveal a ring, a simple but elegant gold band set with a small diamond that caught the afternoon sunlight streaming through the schoolhouse windows. "Nora Mitchell," Roy said, his voice steady despite the emotion visible in his eyes. "I know it hasn't been long, but I love you. I've loved you since that first day at the train station when you looked so lost but so determined all at once. I want to build a life with you at the ranch, here in Stockton, wherever you want to be. Will you marry me?" Tears filled Nora's eyes, not of sadness but of overwhelming joy. The answer was as clear to her as the blue sky outside. "Yes," she whispered, then more strongly. "Yes, Roy, I will marry you." Roy's face broke into a smile of such pure happiness that it nearly took her breath away. With slightly trembling hands, he slipped the ring onto her finger where it fit perfectly. "How did you know my size?" Nora asked, admiring the way the diamond caught the light. Roy's cheeks colored slightly. "I may have borrowed one of your gloves from Mrs. Hollister to measure. She's been something of an accomplice in this plan." Nora laughed, not at all surprised that the boarding house keeper had been involved. "She told me once that you were one of the best men she knew. I've come to see she was right." Roy stepped closer, one hand coming up to gently cup her cheek. "I promise to try to live up to that opinion every day," he said softly before bending to kiss her. Unlike their previous kisses, which had been relatively brief and restrained, this one deepened quickly, expressing all the love and longing they had been holding in check during their courtship. Nora's arms wound around Roy's neck as his encircled her waist, drawing her closer. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Roy rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Nora Mitchell, more than I have words to say." "I love you too, Roy Isaacs," she replied, the words feeling both new and as natural as breathing. "More than I ever thought possible." They announced their engagement that evening at a small gathering at Mrs. Hollister's boarding house, where the landlady had conspired with Roy to invite Mayor and Mrs. Bennett, Dr. and Mrs. Wilson, though not Nancy, who had recently begun courting a young lawyer from Sacramento, and Mr. and Mrs. Parker. The news was met with congratulations and knowing smiles, suggesting that their growing attachment had been obvious to everyone in Stockton long before they had formally acknowledged it themselves. "When's the wedding to be, Mrs. Bennett asked eagerly, always at the forefront of town social events. Roy and Nora exchanged a glance, having discussed this briefly on the walk back from the schoolhouse. "We were thinking August," Nora replied. "After the summer harvest is in, but before school begins again." "A perfect time," Mrs. Hollister approved. "The weather will be lovely, and the orchard at the ranch would make a beautiful setting." The planning began in earnest the very next day, with the women of Stockton rallying around Nora to help prepare for the wedding. Mrs. Parker offered to bake the cake. Mrs. Bennett volunteered to organize the flowers, and Mrs. Wilson promised to help Nora create a wedding dress worthy of the occasion. Roy, meanwhile, threw himself into preparing the ranch house for his bride. With Edward's blessing, conveyed by telegram, he began renovations on the master bedroom, replacing the heavy furniture that had been Richard's with lighter pieces more suited to Nora's taste. He also hired a painter to freshen the walls and ordered new curtains from the general store. The days seemed to fly by as summer progressed. Nora divided her time between wedding preparations and helping Roy at the ranch, learning the routines and responsibilities that would soon be part of her daily life as the rancher's wife. She discovered a natural affinity for the garden, spending peaceful hours tending the vegetables and flowers that Mrs. Benson had planted years ago. In late July, a package arrived from Boston, a wedding gift from Edward Finch. Inside was a beautiful silver tea service, with a note explaining that it had belonged to his grandmother, and that he thought Richard would want Nora and Roy to have it for their new life together. The gesture moved both of them deeply, a final blessing on their union from the man who had, however indirectly, brought them together. On the morning of their wedding day, Nora awoke to sunshine streaming through the window of her room at the boarding house. Today was the day she would become Mrs. Roy Isaacs, a thought that filled her with joy and a quiet certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Mrs. Hollister and Mrs. Wilson arrived shortly after breakfast to help her prepare. The wedding dress they had created together was a marvel of ivory silk with delicate lace trim, modest but undeniably elegant. "You look beautiful, my dear," Mrs. Hollister said, tears glistening in her eyes as she fastened the last button at the back of the dress. "Roy won't know what hit him." "Speaking of Roy," Mrs. Wilson added with a smile, "he's been up since dawn, according to my husband. Apparently, he's checked every detail at the ranch at least 3 times already." Nora laughed, picturing her soon-to-be husband's methodical inspection of the wedding preparations. "That sounds like Roy. He never leaves anything to chance." By early afternoon, everything was ready. Mayor Bennett had agreed to escort Nora down the aisle in place of her father, who had passed away years ago. The schoolchildren, excited to see their teacher become a bride, had formed an informal choir to sing at the ceremony under Mrs. Parker's direction. The orchard at the Finch, soon to be the Isaacs Ranch, had been transformed with ribbons and flowers, rows of chairs set up beneath the apple trees for the guests. At one end, A simple arch covered in summer blooms marked the spot where Nora and Roy would exchange their vows, with the town's minister waiting patiently. Roy stood beneath the arch, looking more handsome than Nora had ever seen him in a new black suit, his dark hair neatly combed, his face freshly shaved. As she began her walk toward him on Mayor Bennett's arm, their eyes met across the distance, and the love she saw in his gaze took her breath away. The ceremony itself was simple but deeply meaningful. They had written their own vows, with Roy promising to love, honor, and cherish Nora all the days of his life, to be her partner in all things, and to build a future with her filled with love and respect. Nora, in turn, vowed to stand beside Roy through all of life's challenges and joys, to create a home with him built on love and understanding, and to be his faithful companion until death parted them. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Roy's kiss was both tender and passionate, a promise of the life they would share. The assembled guests broke into applause, the children cheered, and Nora felt her heart might burst with happiness. The celebration that followed lasted well into the evening, with dancing, feasting, and toasts to the newlyweds' health and happiness. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the orchard, Roy took Nora's hand and led her away from the festivities to a quiet spot beneath one of the largest apple trees. "Happy, Mrs. Isaacs?" he asked, his arms encircling her waist. "Happier than I ever thought possible, Mr. Isaacs," she replied, reaching up to trace the line of his jaw with her fingertips. "And you?" "I have everything I could ever want right here," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "A home, a purpose, and the woman I love to share it all with." As they stood together in the fading light, Nora reflected on the strange twist of fate that had brought her to this moment. She had arrived in Stockton expecting to marry one man, and had instead found love with another. What had seemed like a terrible mistake, meeting the wrong man at the train station, had turned out to be exactly right. "Roy," she said softly, "do you believe in destiny?" He considered the question with his usual thoughtfulness. "I believe that life sometimes takes us on unexpected paths that turn out to be the ones we were meant to follow all along." Nora smiled, thinking of the words he had spoken to her that first day at the train station. "Right place, right time." "Exactly," he agreed, bending to kiss her once more as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky above. 5 years later, Nora stood on the porch of the ranch house, watching as Roy taught their 4-year-old son, Richard, to ride his first pony. The little boy sat proudly on the gentle animal, his father's hand steadying him as they moved slowly around the corral. "Look, Mama," Richard called, his face alight with excitement. "I'm riding like Papa. I see you, sweetheart," Nora called back, adjusting the baby girl in her arms. Little Emma, just 6 months old, regarded the scene with solemn blue eyes that matched her father's. The ranch had prospered under Roy's management and Edward's financial backing. The orchards now produced some of the finest apples in California, shipped as far as San Francisco and even back east. The cattle operation had expanded as well, with Roy implementing new breeding techniques that improved the quality of the herds. Stockton itself had grown too, with new businesses opening along the main street and more families settling in the surrounding area. Nora had continued teaching until Richard's birth, then trained a new teacher, a young woman from Sacramento, who had the same passion for education that Nora herself possessed. Now, Nora divided her time between caring for their children, managing the household, and maintaining the extensive garden that had become her pride and joy. She had also, with Roy's encouragement, started writing articles for the local newspaper on topics ranging from education to home management. discovering a talent for clear, engaging prose that had earned her readers throughout the county. Edward visited twice a year, staying at the ranch house and delighting in his role as honorary uncle to Richard and Emma. He had married a Boston socialite the previous year, and there was talk of them building a summer home in Stockton to allow for extended visits. As Nora watched Roy lift Richard from the pony, praising the boy's first riding lesson, a wave of contentment washed over her. The life she had found in Stockton was richer and more fulfilling than anything she could have imagined when she boarded that train in Boston all those years ago. Roy, having settled Richard on the ground, looked up and caught her eye across the yard. His smile, still capable of quickening her pulse after 5 years of marriage, held all the love and devotion she could ever want. "Come see the new calf, Mama," Richard called, tugging at his father's hand. "Papa says I can help name it." "Let me put Emma down for her nap first," Nora called back with a smile. "Then we'll all go together." As she turned to enter the house, Nora glanced once more at her husband and son, struck by how perfectly Roy embodied the father and husband she had always hoped to find. He was strong yet gentle, firm yet kind, a man who led by example and loved with his whole heart. That evening, after the children were asleep, Roy and Nora sat together on the porch swing, watching the stars emerge in the clear night sky. His arm around her shoulders, her head resting against him, they enjoyed a rare moment of quiet togetherness. "I received a letter from Mrs. Hollister today," Nora said, breaking the comfortable silence. "She says Nancy Wilson is engaged to that lawyer from Sacramento after all. They're to be married in the spring." Roy nodded, his fingers absently stroking Nora's arm. "That's good news. Nancy deserves to be happy." "She also mentioned that 3 more families have moved to Stockton in the past month," Nora continued. "The town is growing so quickly." "Progress," Roy observed, "though I hope it never grows so large that we lose the sense of community." Nora turned her face up to his. "Do you ever regret it? Staying in one place for so long? You told me once that you wandered for years after the war." Roy's expression grew thoughtful. "Not for a single day," he said finally, his voice firm with conviction. "Everything I wandered looking for, I found right here with you, with our children, with this land." He bent to kiss her, a kiss that held the familiar comfort of their years together, but also the enduring passion that had sparked between them from the beginning. "Besides," he added with a smile as they broke apart, "as I told you that first day, it was right place, right time for me. For us." Nora nestled closer to him, thinking of all the twists of fate that had brought them together: Richard's untimely death, her decision to come west anyway, Roy being the one to meet her at the station. What had seemed like the wrong man at the time had turned out to be exactly the right one. "Right place, right time," she agreed softly, the words a benediction on the life they had built together. As the stars wheeled overhead and the gentle sounds of the night surrounded them, Nora and Roy sat content in each other's company, their love as steady and enduring as the land that had brought them together. In the room above them, their children slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that they were cherished. And in the distance, the lights of Stockton twinkled like earthbound stars, a reminder of the community that had welcomed a lost mail-order bride and helped her find her true home. For Nora Mitchell Isaacs, the journey that had begun with a photograph and a stack of letters had led her not to the man she had expected to marry, but to the man she was meant to love. And in that unexpected turn of events, she had found a happiness beyond anything she could have imagined, proof that sometimes the wrong man at the station turns out to be exactly the right man after all.